basically, the real reason for being here today is to try and give you some mechanics. I am definitely kind of a mechanical kind of guy. And today's effort is to give you some mechanics, some things you can actually go back and do, even this afternoon, to actually start doing real, honest-to-gosh project risk management. And that, to me, is one of the real tragedies associated with risk management, is people get involved in it, they have the discussions about it, but then they actually don't do anything about it. They feel enlightened, but don't necessarily go down the road of doing something about it. And what we're hoping to accomplish today is to give you some of the mechanics, if you will, of how you can go about actually doing it rather than just talking about it. And the first thing is, when it comes to any project, no matter how simple, no matter how complex, this is the sad side of risk management. It's in trouble already. You know from day one, you know from the moment you get started, that it's going to have problems. There are bad things that may happen. And because of that, nobody wants to have this conversation. Nobody likes talking about the bad things that may happen. In just about a week and a half, I'm going to be taking a trip overseas, and in the process of doing so, I'm going to be flying across the Atlantic. As I do so, it's noteworthy because I've brought this up in a couple of my risk classes, in fact, since the Air France crash, and I've said, well, you know, what's one of the risks associated with my flight? And everybody is afraid to say it. And that is, my plane could crash. Could it happen? Yes. And the reason people are reticent about saying anything about it is they are afraid. They are afraid that simply by saying it, they are invoking it to happen. Some people believe in the notion of self-fulfilling prophecy. We're just coming out of the end of, and you can see I've got a deer here. Any of you who have been in any of my regular workshops, you know there's one risk story I tell in virtually every one, and that is about 13, no, it's been even longer than that, about 14 years ago, I was driving into work, and I used to work down in Arlington, Virginia, which is a lovely part of the Washington, D.C. area, and used to go down the GW Parkway. And as I was ripping down the GW Parkway one morning at about 5:30 in the morning, people don't think about this in the big city, but as I'm cruising along, I realized there's no cars in front of me. There wasn't a one in front of me. It was perfect. Life was good. I was making time. And then I came around the bend by the CIA, by the Central Intelligence Agency, and just as I made that bend, there in the middle of the highway, Bambi. And I did what any right-thinking driver does in dense rush hour traffic. I hit my brakes as hard as I could, but that didn't change anything. I simply ran. The deer got down in that crouch position, and I ran up onto instead of running into this rather substantial deer. And yes, the deer passed away. But I found myself, my front wheels off the pavement, and I found myself becoming the clog in the morning rush hour. Now, people ask me what the risk is of driving in Washington. My answer is deer. They're everywhere. The problem is, how many deer did I strike in 16 years of commuting into the district? The answer is one. But even so, because I whacked it once, it now looms large in my mind. And this is part of the problem we have when it comes to risk management. Part of it is deer, those things that we've run into or seen others run into, and they're fresh and they're painful. That's why when it comes to plane flights right now, as a matter of fact, Mike and I were talking before we all came online. Mike just got back from overseas as well, and I'm sure that somebody somewhere on his flight was talking about the recent Air France crash. And they were talking about, gee, I hope that doesn't happen to us. And they're afraid to say these things largely because the fear is that if I say it, it actually increases the probability of it happening. So I'll just keep my mouth shut. That's one of the problems, and the other problem is that the people will say it just because it's something that is fresh in their mind, not something that's actually likely to happen. Every project is going to have some measure of risk. One thing that we can do right off the bat, though, is to make sure that we're actually saying risk properly. Most people don't even speak the language well. And the language of risk is to essentially say it's the bad things that may happen and the impacts they may cause. Now, just remember that. It's the bad thing that may happen and the impact it may cause. Now, we have to say it properly. It's not, now, look at the difference between these two statements. It's not just, we might be late. That's not a risk event. The risk event is the client might be late in getting us a list of interviewees, which will make us as much as 3 weeks late. There's information instead of data. there's real rich information there. And the reason the information is a lot richer now is because we know what might drive us to be late and how bad this could actually be. Are we worried about being late by years, weeks, days, hours? It makes a big difference. And if we say the risk statements well, and this is something where if you're looking for a quick fix to most basic risk practices, this is the first and simplest one. Get people to speak the language clearly. Now, for wherever you are, some of you are West Coast, some of you are East Coast, some of you are across the pond, wherever you're coming in from or calling in from, let me just make a point here. Earthquake. Earthquake, is that a risk? And the answer is obviously going to be, well, yeah. But then comes the question, okay, what's the risk event? What are we really worried about with an earthquake? Are you worried about getting crushed under a building? Are you worried about losing connectivity for more than a couple of days? Are you worried about not being able to get into work or not being able to get home from work? And by virtue of knowing those kinds of concerns, we can evaluate the degree of impact that's associated with something like this happening to us. The whole point of saying it well and saying clearly what you're really worried about, the bad things that may happen and the impacts they may cause, by saying that clearly, what we afford ourselves is the ability to have a smarter conversation. That smarter conversation is going to be built on the whole notion of, I know what the real potential problem is, and I can actually have some modicum of control over how badly it's going to hurt me. Earthquake. If I told you only had 30 seconds till an 8.2 on the Richter scale class earthquake, most of you would probably be flying for the doorways. Now, what if I told you with reasonable certainty it was going to happen in, say, 4 hours? Most of you are not flying for doorways. Instead, you're just, well, probably getting out of there and notifying family and getting on a plane to get off the ground before the earthquake hits. If I told you had 4 months until the earthquake hit, you'd either be buying insurance or selling your real estate. Note the difference in our responses. The difference in our responses is going to be rooted in both a clear understanding of what the risk event may be and early warning. The earlier we know what may potentially happen to us, the better off we all are. The problem is, I've experienced the deer. I'm the one who has struck a deer, and I know the experience. And I can try and make you share that experience with me, but even so, none of you will have the same trepidation associated with that as I do. I have that fear, I have that trepidation, largely because I've been the one who's actually lived it. I'm the one who's actually been through that experience. Each of you has your own experiences as well. And that's something we need to keep in mind, is that people need to share their experiences. Some people are better at sharing than others, though. And that's part of the problem. If any of you have ever been in a brainstorm for risk management, you've had that one team member who just dominates the entire discussion. And they continue to try and get everybody scared about what they're scared about. Our ideal, our real goal should be to try and make sure we're getting an even distribution of input from our team members because they have a broad variety of experiences. They have different things that they have whacked along the way in their career. They have different deer, different things that they're frightened of and that they've encountered. The key to doing that, though, is not necessarily just brainstorming, because in a brainstorm, some people don't like to share in open forum for fear of the Air France effect. They don't want people actually worrying about, oh my gosh, I'm going to invoke this to happen again. And secondly, they don't want to be seen as naysayers. There's a lot of naysaying that's perceived when you say, gee, shipping may not get those things delivered to us on time. They may not get the documentation out to the client on time. And when you say that, it's like the shipping people suddenly get real defensive, and they're like, hey, don't say we're going to be the foul-ups here. Well, the reality is what we need to do is to find a